I'm Zachary Abdul from Amnesty International, Middlesex University, London. Everyone can just call me Zach, please do. So with us today, we have Mr. Akshay Sharan, Ms. Jude Radwan, and Dr. Francis Ohanyidu. I apologize if I mispronounced any of your names. Thank you for all being here with us this evening. We may have some attendees coming in or out. Let us begin with some introductions. With us, we have Dr. Francis Ohanyidu, adjunct professor, physician, and development strategist with over 2 decades of experience in international private and public organizations with world's leading development organizations with strong multi-country experience. In Africa, he is a leader and a global voice for universal health coverage. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Ohanyidu.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar.
We also have with us Mr. Akshay Sharan. He is a social and cultural psychologist who studies a range of topics, including intergroup conflict, pro-social behavior, social identity, empathy, liberal bias in academia, and morality. He got his MSc in social and cultural psychology from London School of Economics and Political Science. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Akshay Sharan.
Thank you for having me, Zach. I'm looking forward to our discussions. I've met with Dr. Francis before, but not with Ms. Radwan. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And also we have with us Ms. Jude Radwan calling us from Saudi Arabia. She is an activist for child mental health and a volunteer at the Clinic for Child Mental Health. Thank you so much for being with us, Jude.
Thank you for having me.
Jude got her bachelor's degree from Northeastern University in psychology, and we're very happy to have you with us, Ms. Jude.
I'm very happy to be here.
So, first of all, we're going to begin with some opening remarks. Our topic is stigmas connected to mental health. Which one of our speakers want to begin with some opening remarks? Dr. Ohanyidu, would you like to take the floor for some opening remarks?
All right. I think it's important that everybody understands that globally we have a challenge and it's worsening. Mental health is a major challenge, first of all. So because mental health is a global challenge and it's worsening we have a lot of challenges around that. And because it's neglected and people don't understand much of mental health as an issue concurrent with health. It tends to be more something that is abstract, the normal component of health. You know it. And because of that, like in developing countries, there's this tendency to pay more emphasis on infectious diseases at the expense of even the mental health component. And then in developed countries, it's more about non-communicable diseases, which challenges them, and they look at mental health as something that is in the back door, you know. So it's a problem that is with us, and we need to rein it in as soon as possible because our population globally is growing. People with mental health problems are increasing. The numbers, there's a projection that puts that 1 in 4 people have some form of mental health disorder. You know, so that's a large number of people. So we need to begin to think around that and how best we can be able to address stigma, which is often associated because of lack of good information, lack of understanding, and also due to social factors too that often are beyond people. You know, so I think we need to understand that baseline before we proceed with the discussion.
Yes, thank you. There are multiple factors that we need to take in account before discussing this topic deeply. And I look forward to hearing all of them from you Dr. Ohanidu. Miss Jude, Akshay, Mr. Akshay, would you like to open up with some remarks? Miss Jude? Your mic is muted.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay. So since we're talking about the stigma of mental health, it's important to know where stigma comes from. And although like there are many facets, most of it comes from either lack of understanding or fear. And the media also plays a major role with the inaccurate representations of people with mental disorders in several movies, films. And so a study was made that showed that people in the public might accept medical or genetical nature of problems more than mental health disorders. And they believe that when it comes to mental disorders, treatment is not necessary. And so this also comes from a lack of understanding. So it's important to have talks and conversations like this that make us talk about the topic.
Absolutely. Awareness is a massive part of what we try to do. Thank you, Mr. Jude. Mr. Akshay?
Yeah, I completely agree with the points raised by Dr. Ohanido and Ms. Radwan. And just to sort of add on to Ms. Radwan's point, I mean, where do these stigmas actually come from, and how is it that we're stuck in like this vicious cycle where stigmas continue to exist? Despite, I mean, there being many efforts over the past at least 30 years or so to destigmatize mental health, owing to whether that's conflict or owing to any other socio-cultural aspects that are important. And I just like to highlight that how it's so important for all of us to understand how social identity works and what the social psychology of stigma actually is. Because ultimately that's the fundamental um, place where stigmas actually even begin. So whatever groups we belong to, they all have either desirable or certain undesirable characteristics, of course, in terms of perceptions. Um, Anything that is termed as desirable and undesirable is at a perceptual level. So it's what we think people think of us. And unfortunately, what that actually does in the case of stigmas related to mental health is that it creates this vicious cycle where every time we're in a similar situation, we feel that our undesirable characteristics of the groups that we belong to are being highlighted. And that in turn actually leads to a lot of psychological and physiological issues that we're not even aware of. And that's exactly how mental illness is even created. So it's almost like stigma and mental illness are part of the same vicious cycle where it's one after the other. And unfortunately, I mean, we're heading towards a state where it's going to be uncontrollable. So I'm looking forward to discussing even some potential solutions, perhaps, for destigmatization.
Yes, absolutely. We will try to look into some examples of some solutions around the world. Thank you so much. So I would like to remind our participants, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat function or in the comment section on our Facebook Live. Thank you all for being here again. So let us begin with the question, the basic question about where these stigmas come from. Dr. Ohanido, I would like to ask, since you work in development, where do these stigmas come from, particularly in your work, in your area of work in Africa? Where do these stigmas come from, and how does that um, become a hurdle towards your work in development?
Okay, I need to state that in this case, we are talking about stigma in relation to mental health. And this has a lot to do with the way people perceive you. And usually it's in a negative sense because of that mental, assumed or present mental illness in that person. So it tends to be discriminatory too, because it's a component of it. And often the problem with it is that it has to do with belief systems and people's attitude to things. And, you know, a lot of them, like Jude pointed out, have to do with also medium of information. So a lot of time, this is a reminder of the importance of health literacy. People's level of health literacy matters. The way they perceive people who have any kind of disease, matters. So most often, because they don't understand the mental health, so there's a tendency to that element of disgrace associated with that particular circumstance or quality or the person who is involved with that. So in Africa, you often see that there are old wives' tale stories about all sorts of things being probably demonic or from all sorts of occultic sources without people understanding that a lot of issues that are problems related to mental health are actually either things that have to do with sometimes hormonal or imbalance or substance abuse and other sources and not necessarily spiritism or possession by extraordinary forces and all that. So this also, because people don't understand, they often have this fear, like Ashwan mentioned, because it drives that. And ignorance is the fundamental driver, especially in low-income settings where people are markedly low in literacy level. So it's very important, and that's the commonest thing in Africa. So when you see this problem, there are actually three components that you can look at stigma from. You can look at stigma from the problem of knowledge. Uh, she, they don't understand it, so they are ignorant. So they react based on ignorance. Then the second layer is to look at it from the side of attitude. Side of attitude in the sense that this person is behaving in a way that does not conform to what I know. So you see prejudice is already prejudicial against that person. Or the problem of behavior. Expectations may be totally aberrant what you expect from in terms of behavior. So you have discrimination. Oh, this person eats abnormal things because of mental, health. This person breaks certain rules that mental health. So you see discrimination. So, and the group of people who have this in the African society, that type of behavior, people tend to ostracize them and see them, keep them afar at arm length because they cannot associate with them. So in the course of development, you find that this is a critical part. And even in the health facilities, you find that some providers, because of what mental health is, even though they are health people, they also tend to discriminate against some of these people. So stigma has those three cardinal components, and it's very important that when we look at stigma in terms of finding solutions, we are also looking at those.
Well, thank you for putting it into components. That made it a lot easier for me to understand. Thank you so much, Dr. Ohanidu. Most definitely, these stigmas really differ around cultures. That goes to my next question for Mr. Sharon. When it comes to the differences of stigmas between cultures, I would like to ask you, as a social and cultural psychologist, what kind of conflicts could that could arise between different cultures in relation to stigmas?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Of course, there's absolutely the most obvious reason has to do with development, of course. So countries that are considered to be developed, obviously the expectation becomes that the attention given to stigmas related to mental health would be higher and would increase and would in turn lead to even an increased investment into mental illness as a concept. But it's fascinating to see because that's the fundamental cultural expectation would be that countries that are less developed would not be able to target these stigmas related to mental illness because of the lack of infrastructure, because of the lack of funding, and that the West or the developed countries would be able to do so. But actually, what we're seeing is that there are a lot more community-driven initiatives in developing countries, which seem to be proving to be way more effective in tackling stigmas related to mental health. And this is absolutely a commentary on the conditions of some of the programs that governments choose to run related to mental health, which are extremely limited due to whatever perceived lack of resources or the lack of interest or potentially the lack of return on investment. But I do think that's an extremely short-sighted view. Just to give you an example, in Nepal, for example, they saw that even if you do include mental health care as an aspect of primary health and primary health care, there's still a huge stigma even at the institutional level. So all doctors, all nurses in primary healthcare spaces uh, still believe that there are two different identities, in the sense that there are people who have mental illnesses and there are people who do not. As soon as we sort of create that categorization, it automatically leads to prejudice and discrimination at the conceptual and at the behavioral level. So what was done was, by a group of researchers, they launched a 12-month intervention where they did a sort of desensitization using a targeted intervention. And what they found was that there was a significant, almost a 40% increase in positive attitudes towards those with mental illness. And this is just evidence that um, if Nepal, with what I would assume is a limited funding in terms of mental health care, if they're able to pull off something like that, then countries that are considered to be more developed should definitely be at a stage where they are not right now. So I would just conclude by saying that from a cultural perspective, what's happening is really unique. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next year or so. Once vaccinations are complete and once people start moving again, it'd be fascinating to see how different countries with different beliefs, with different uh, people, how they react.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Sharon. It does have a lot to do with development, and I'm waiting to see what will it be like after everything gets moving. Um, it's interesting to think about it in a way that it's more focused on willpower rather than funding. Many developed countries with the funding do not have the kind of willpower to make important change. Thank you so much for making those great points, Mr. Sharon. Now we'll move with to Ms. Radwan. Thank you for being with us this evening. I just want to ask, since we've established the causes of stigmas and where they come from, I would also want to ask the influences of such stigmas. Now, from a young person's perspective and from a student perspective, how can these stigmas influence you?
Sure. So I just wanted to mention one thing. As we talk about stigma, it's also important to mention that there's something called self-stigma, which is not only the stigma of the people around you, but from the way we're conditioned, from the way we act, from the way everything, people start having their own stigmas around mental health and their own struggles. And because of that, people tend to, as mentioned before, there's a vicious cycle, and people tend to not seek help, whether it's because they feel shy or they feel like they're weak and it's their fault. And because they don't seek help, they don't get educated, they stay in that vicious cycle of they're in their mental health problems and they don't get treated. As me being personally, in the clinic that I worked at, I've seen a lot of people who come to me with problems saying that it was really hard for them to open up in the beginning. They said that their problems were like different from anyone else, and that was a key factor in why it took them so long to ask for help or come to a clinic or such. And most of the times, when having conversations with these people after they finally open up, I realized that I've heard or read or studied about those problems multiple times. So being in that shell that makes you alone, and being in that vicious cycle of not wanting to seek help for whatever reason, whatever stigma, whether it's self-stigma or public stigma, stops people from understanding the idea of mental health and themselves as well. And so it doesn't allow people to seek help, and it makes people's problems in their head seem bigger, as the fact that they're the only ones going through that and that no one else is going through that. And then it would be very helpful to have some discussion. As seen in a 2020 survey, they said that 14 to 22-year-olds found that 90% of teens and young adults experience symptoms of depression. And a way to soothe that rather than go to clinics was to search on personal anecdotes online for other people who have went through such things. So having a conversation about stuff like this, having activism on social media, on whatever allows people to feel better about opening such topics.
Self-stigma, that is really great point to bring up. Thank you so much. That was quite an eye-opener. So I would like to swing it back to Dr. Ohanidu. In terms of combating these stigmas, in terms of identifying them, what can we do in order to develop ourselves and our societies around us?
Okay, I think that's a germane question. And let me first say that if we want to remove stigma, we have to look at it at different layers, and it involves both stakeholder and institutional actions. And we need to design a sort of framework that looks at it. Let me give you an example. One of the challenge to mental health, like I mentioned earlier on, is around the way we view mental health. In even one of the speakers also alluded to that, the way we view it, even as providers of health care. So that challenge is a big one. So one of the things that government needs to do at the level of government as the stewards of the health system is one, that government needs to deliver a national mental health service for its citizens. And this should be closely integrated with the normal health system strategies that government rolls out in terms of implementing health. It should not be seen as an independent thing, because if you still make mental health an independent thing, it also further stigmatizes the participants in that space, the people with those problems. So government needs to make sure mental health is integrated in the normal packages of health, in terms of service delivery, in terms of how we organize health and deliver it, because that is very critical. From the tertiary to the primary health care level, mental health needs to be part of primary health care. And mental health needs to also be able to be receptive in its implementation. Like in some countries, you have adolescent and young people's health programs or health facilities that cater for adolescents and young people or youth. These health facilities should have providers trained in identifying mental health as part of their service delivery. This is very important. Then, in order to make it work, government needs to also budget effectively for mental health. There should be a minimum budget or package of care around mental health, like any other disease entity. And this budget should be monitored transparently, especially in low-income countries with corruption and all that. Then government needs to prioritize research, home-level evidence around the issues around mental health. Mental health are not the same exactly in every country. The drivers are different. There are countries that have higher rate of substance abuse. There are countries that have higher rates of violence per se because of certain social issues in those countries. So the things that drive mental health are quite not exactly the same for every country. Every country needs to be able to have some level of research that generates evidence around mental health. And these findings should be disseminated across stakeholders so they understand what the key issues are. Then international donors shape mental health programs in developing countries, and they need to buy into these things, and they need to make to understand that also that those incomes they put in, or the resources they put into these countries have to also have that component that speaks to mental health. Then non-state actors like NGOs, civil societies generally, and all that need to be able to be at that point with people, the community, to be able to give both community voice and also do demand creation and awareness around mental health, because you need the people to know, and that's why I talked about health literacy. People need to understand those issues, even if they are illiterate. So we need to be able to bring up their level of health literacy to be able to conceive mental health and run away from all the superstition and wrong notions about mental health, and also remove the fear that they have around people that have mental health and be able to tackle and identify and also refer them to health facilities where needed, then that's a community thing. And the community itself needs to understand what is important in terms of lifestyle modification and how they can effectively be able to get young people to understand what risk factors are there in their communities around mental health. So at all stages, there should be that issue of a synergy between input in terms of financing, input in terms of action of partners and stakeholders, and the platforms for interventions could even include, like Jude mentioned, include things like technology. How do you use technology to better do demand creation around mental health? Some people want to quietly discuss their mental problems. They don't want to make it public. But openness is very critical. We should also encourage that where those people are willing to come out openly, good. And where they want to keep their privacy intact, there should be a way to be able to pull them into that space to get the best of treatment around mental health. So these are some of the strategies that I can recommend, looking at those layers of government and stakeholders, So, and this will pull across the issues around the both macro and the micro level of the issues of mental health.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Hamidu. You're absolutely right in terms of like mental health being pushed aside and not really focused on and prioritized. That is a really great point. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamidu. We really do need to construct this package and to assist people. But that leads me to another question. But before I ask it, I would like to remind our participants to please do ask questions in our chat function below or in the comments section of our Facebook Live. Now, Dr. Ohanyudu, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who is trying to come out of their shell to explain their issues with a mental health professional?
Yeah, I think the advice first is to engage a system that is receptive to you. One of the things that, like I said, discrimination and all that are challenges. The person who has a mental health issue and knows the first step in even getting treatment is to know you have a mental health challenge. And if you're able to know it and it's not that severe that that removes your understanding of what the issues are around you. So if you're able to identify first that you have that mental health disease, to begin to do a sort of identification process for a receptive place where you can have that conversation around what your issues are. And there are some places in every country you have them, but they may not be as widespread as that offer you that opportunity. And they are experts. They are clinical psychologists. There are people who are clinical psychiatrists and all that who can work with you through coming out of that process. If you identify the right facility, the right service provider that can deliver that, that is the second step. And you walk through them because it's not something that that is solved in a day. It's something that is over a process, and you'll be like somebody being weaned out of a situation. So, and then of course, where there's appropriate treatment that involves drugs, they will provide for you and all that, and help you through the process and hold you, because you need that hand holding to be able to get out of it. It's a bit difficult for an individual who is already still in a mental, like depression, for example, to be able to come out of it based on personal volition. Some people are able to do it, but it's not everybody that has that capacity to pull themselves out of that sense of desolation and failure and all that. So you need a hand holding, an expert who understands where you are to pull you out of that situation. So those are very important. So identifying the right spaces to be able to have that conversation about your health is very important. But where the person has not that capacity, then it's now left for immediate relatives if they are there, or friends, to be able to identify such a place and help them and encourage them to go through that process. Those are very, very critical because, like I said, discrimination is there. And if you don't go to the right place, it can further push them further into their mental health, worsen their mental health condition.
I absolutely agree that level of engagement is really important, and everyone has to realize that it will not happen overnight. Progress won't happen overnight. Thank you so much for those great points, Dr. Ohanidu. Now, Mr. Sharon, um, I would like to ask you more about your experiences in India um, towards your work as well. Um, what kind of stigmas do you look at and study in India, and what kind of hurdles do they give you when you're trying to combat stigmas?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Zach. So, I don't do a lot of research specifically on stigmas related to mental health in India. But of course, in related research that we do at the institutional level, there's a lot of on-ground interaction with um, rural populations as well as urban populations. And a fascinating thing um that I experienced was during my undergraduate degree when I was writing my thesis dissertation. There was an automatic aversion in rural Indian participants from the subject matter of psychology. Um, it was so I think that's where it actually starts. I mean, and that's why education, as highlighted by Mr. Adwan, is so important. I mean, there isn't even a basic understanding of what psychology is. So how can we expect that something like mental health is supposed to seep into the poorer parts of rural India? So I think that's a major challenge, which is the stigma related to the subject more than mental health. Of course, for mental health, I mean, one of the most important things in India is religion and the religious diversity that exists. And that automatically is a barrier. The intensity of faith that we have in our country is a barrier to seeking mental health care because, as any other religious person or extremely religious individual would know, um, we expect that our problems can be taken care of by something much larger than all of us. And in most situations, that is some form of God. Um, and automatically, there is a barrier in the sense that no one, not even elders in the family, not even the people who manage household finances, they're not okay with anyone seeking mental health care because these problems are not supposed to exist. If they do exist, you're supposed to pray and allow those problems to be solved for you by something that is much higher than us. So I think, and of course, everyone else will also have interesting perspectives on the intersection between religion and mental health care and why that's a challenge. Of course, every country has its own cultural practices and beliefs, and it's the duty of researchers in those countries to be sensitive to those beliefs while also carrying out, let's say, interventions or even descriptive research to understand what the on ground situation is. Um, yeah, that's all I have to say. I just had another point to make based on what Dr. Francis was saying about how we've isolated mental health away from primary healthcare, of course, and other forms of health that exist. Um, and here I'd like to highlight um, about how we need to develop a more intersectional and also a more interdisciplinary perspective when we talk about issues such as mental health. We see it often only in isolation, and it seems like we are a minority community, people who are seeking mental health care change, as compared to the majority, which doesn't yet have an educated understanding of what mental health even is. Um, and it's interesting because I mean, there's loads of research that already exists, but unfortunately, there's this gap that we have between the scientific research that we do and what we actually communicate to the regular public. Just to highlight a study just only from last year, um, those with even the most common mental illnesses, and this includes issues even like mild anxiety, they are 3 times more likely to be unemployed as compared to someone who does not have a mental illness. And that's the case only for common disorders. For severe disorders, they're 7 times more likely to be unemployed as compared to those who do not have mental health disorders. I mean, automatically, this shows that mental health is not affecting only the mental health of an individual, which is not going to have an impact outside of the individual. It's going to have an impact at the macro level. It's going to impact the GDP of the country. It's going to impact unemployment. It's going to impact inclusion. It's going to impact what the political ratings for the existing government in power are. So there's an influence all across the board, but it seems like we're unable to see that. But I do hope that that's going to change and we do start moving more to the macro level to understand how we can address these issues.
Absolutely, yeah. That those statistics are absolutely staggering. Many people do not really understand the sort of impact these stigmas can have towards a country, its economy, and many different factors. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Mr. Sharon. I do have another question for you. When it, you said that it those sort of stigmas approached you quite early on. I'd like to ask you what kind of stigmas can be identified on an institutional level?
Sure. Do you mind rephrasing that question?
So when it comes to research, when it comes to universities and healthcare providers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, I mean, it's so important that all these different aspects that exist within society work together, because it is the institutional responsibility of those who are conducting the research, of course. While there are many other stakeholders, which includes public health authorities, it includes the people living in rural and urban India who might be potential participants. Um, and I think what we need to emphasize is how this research is only for our benefit. What's often happening is that universities are often appear to be these daunting spaces where people don't want to get involved in what's going on inside, at least outsiders or those that live outside the walls of that institution. Um, and that is an extreme challenge because it often hampers issues of data collection, of course, which is absolutely critical to research in the field of psychology, and in biases and in understanding even the stigmas related to mental health. So I think what's most important from a researcher's perspective is that sort of rapport formation. And ultimately, that rapport can only be formed, or not can only be formed, but I believe that it's usually better formed when the two individuals interacting, the researcher and the participant, are from the same country, of course, come from the same similar sort of cultural heritage, because there's a sense of shared social identity. And that shared identity actually breaks a significant amount of the ice that exists at the institutional level when you talk about large scale research on different topics. So I think that rapport is absolutely critical. On top of that, I think the second most important, and I'm going to end here, of course, is that the ethical considerations that we keep in mind. And this includes issues that we're seeing across the world today of data sharing, confidentiality, privacy. Um, it's absolutely crucial to be ethically reviewed by an IRB or an institutional review board or something similar. Uh, but unfortunately, that does not happen in most institutions in developing countries. I don't think, not to my knowledge, there's no mandate for that to even exist. Um, yes, it does exist when you're required to go to a journal for submission, for example. But for people collecting data, it does not necessarily exist. And I think there needs to be an improvement in the ethical code of conduct so that we can actually reach out and create that relationship with the citizens of our own countries in order to understand what the on ground situation is and how even theory might possibly help them in addressing that.
Thank you so much. Those are a lot of aspects more than I have expected. Thank you so much for bringing those up, Mr. Sharon. Now, Miss Jude Radwan, I have a few questions for you as well. Now, you are calling us here from Saudi Arabia. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to ask you how stigmas are created there and the structure of them, and also what kind of differences you've seen when you've traveled to the United States uh, to to pursue your bachelor's degree.
Sure. Adding on to the idea of religion and how religion affects just everything in general, here there's this kind of notion that's lessening at the moment, but it's still there and was there when I started before I went to study, that it is one's own fault if they struggle from mental illness, and they don't think of it as a mental illness. They think of it as a symptom due to you straying away from God or not being religious enough or whatever. And so therefore, like mentioned before, the solution wouldn't be to treat such mental disorders because they don't view it as mental disorders, but rather get closer to God or just prayer or whatever. And so that kind of creates a stigma in itself, and it creates a boundary where people, especially the younger generation, don't feel like they can talk to their parents or anyone in their family about it. And so they're forced into that cycle of either finding things online or not seeking help. I've had multiple people who I know here who wanted to seek help, but have been told by their family that it's not like you can get over it by yourself, it's not real. Or there's also the idea of privacy here that's very important, prestige. So the idea that going to someone and telling them your intimate stories or details or whatever it is you want to share is considered kind of taboo, because the idea is what stays in your household stays in your household, and there's this very important emphasis on privacy. Going to America, I honestly in the beginning naively thought it was going to be like so different. I mean, obviously there are advantages and disadvantages. In the university, I've had some of my friends who tried to seek mental health from the college counseling services, and it is through them that I learned that the same goes. So they're very underfunded and there's not a lot of staff. And because of that, they only prioritize like very high intense cases, like people who are suicidal at the moment or are a danger to themselves or others. And other than that, you're basically either given like a pamphlet or something and are forced to deal with it by yourself. So given maybe that there's no type of religious stigma as much in the US or whatever, there's still this lack of importance people have on the idea that is treatment of mental health and just talking about it.
Thank you so much for those insights and on your personal experiences. These discussions are very, very important, and that's why we're here this evening. Thank you so much, Mr. Radwan. Dr. Ohanidu, I'm going to circle back to you right now. But first, I'd like to also remind our participants again, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat function below or in the comments section of our Facebook Live. Now, Dr. Ohanidu, what kind of level of responsibility is there towards the government, towards public health services, and towards individuals and others are there, and how is that responsibility shared?
Apologies, I forgot I muted myself. All right, so yes, so the truth of it is that health governance, right, lies squarely with government, and nobody or no organization, no non-state actors can replace government. It is only left for us to work with government, for government to do the right things through advocacy, through creating the enabling environment for these things to happen. So the light chunk of responsibility still lies with government. And but often you find that government itself does not even totally understand the issue of mental health. So it's now left for the non-state actors to be the advocates, to be the ones that set the pieces on the chess table or chessboard for government to be able to play. And to give government that level of guidance, so and support too, and hand-holding to be able to do the right things, because often it's a systemic thing. How mental health is approached is a system thing. Those gaps in terms of mental health and like integration of primary healthcare is a major issue. And so if government does not sit right in terms of driving it, there will be problem in terms of how stakeholders drive it in the long run. Yes, so it's a very, very important thing for government to get it right. So frameworks coming. If you look at the enabling environment, the government can work around making sure first at the layer of policy that policy is in place around mental health. A lot of countries don't have mental health policy that integrates mental health into the normal system all the way to primary health care level. They may have some level of guidelines in terms of for clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, which are often professionally driven by their trade associations. So you see that gap. So there's a wide gap between what government is supposed to be doing for mental health and what exists on ground. So that's a major issue. So the other level of responsibility is us as communities. Community in the generic sense. Community could be in terms of blood relatives. Is there something happening in your family? You have to be your brother or sister's keeper. Is there something you've noticed abnormal, what you may see as something that does not conform with the norm with any of your relatives? Can you be able to discuss with that person? Be the first touch ground for that person in terms of identifying there's an issue. Sometimes, like I said earlier on, a lot of people have mental health problems, but they don't understand they even have a problem. So you need to have touch boards for them, that sounding board that enables them to see that mirror and say, oh, look, this person is making a point. Some may be in denial, but you can still find a way to work with them towards that point where they understand there's an issue. So responsibility mostly is with government, and because government controls the macro level in terms of looking at the health system. So it is more with government. Then the individual layer and the community layer have their responsibility to do, and the non-state actors, other participants in the system, need to play their role. It is not all of government alone, but all of every sector. But government holds most of the responsibility around making sure mental health works.
Absolutely. It is a systemic issue that needs to be tackled on every single layer of the system, from the community all the way till the government. Thank you so much for answering that for us. Now, Mr. Sharon, I will circle to you now. I would like to ask you, when it comes to a researcher's side or an individual side, what kind of differences can we make in changing the system, as the systemic issue, as Dr. Ohanidu mentioned?
Thanks for the question, Zach. I'm really happy you asked me this question, because I do have a few words to share on this. Um, I think since whenever this mental health revolution of sorts has started, let's say the last 2 decades or 3 decades, um, it's always been up to the individuals and for, let's say, practitioners to create that sort of awareness regarding mental health. Um, while I think that was a great start, and we did that and we tried that for 20 years, 30 years, I don't think we're moving at the pace that we actually do need to move at. Uh, Absolutely, from a cross-cultural perspective, irrespective of developed or developing. And I think a big barrier, as Dr. Francis also mentioned, is it happens to be governments across the world. Honestly, there are these token gestures that keep happening every few years. Um, for example, in 2018, the United Kingdom appointed a minister for loneliness. Uh, Given how there was a rapid increase in a lot of uh, shocking statistics in some sense. I mean, divorce rates were absolutely over the moon in the United Kingdom. It was at 42%, which automatically leads to a lot of associated mental health issues, which might not qualify as disorders, but that does not mean that it does not remain an issue. Similarly, in 2020 or 2021, actually, just a month ago, Japan, due to its increasing suicide rate, had to hire a minister for loneliness as well. So they keep setting up new positions, and I would assume that these positions are, again, underfunded or not funded as we would expect. But I do think that we now need to start putting the onus onto these institutions. There absolutely has not been enough public advocacy in favor of mental health reform so far. I mean, if you look at protests, for example, across the world, they happen on a wide range of issues, but it's almost rare to ever see a protest surrounding mental health reform, which is absolutely fundamental because, I mean, it's people like a lot of us here today who are under the age of 35, for example. In India, 65% of our population is under the age of 35. If we don't do this now, then honestly, in some sense, we might get ruined both as an economy, even as a culture, uh, because our children are not going to receive anything. And I think it's our duty and it's our responsibility at this age where we are motivated to create this sort of change, to put the onus onto these governments. And here I just like to highlight, and I think this is why I came onto board with World Leaders for Mental Health, which is a PMF initiative, um, where like we need to start holding these world leaders accountable. And these world leaders include ex-heads of state, they include sitting ministers, they include civil servants. I mean, if these are not the people who need to start speaking up, then I mean, we can't really expect any change. So I do think we need to start taking the ball to their court. Uh, of course, it's an entirely different conversation as to how we can do that. But protest absolutely continues to exist as a very feasible option for something like this. Um, just to give you an example, I mean, what the governments across the world have done with vaccine logistics, it's absolutely phenomenal. They've educated entire populations. Of course, I'm not generalizing across the world, but there has been a conscious attempt to educate people about vaccines, why they should get them, why it's safe. I mean, just to put things into perspective, how different is that from what is required for mental health? Mental health issues have been killing people for much longer than coronavirus has, for example. But why is it that we can't seem to have any communication from the top down level using a top down approach? Uh, and this fascinating word called the trickle down effect that we keep talking about. Uh, I think it can work if we look at mental health, because it has worked for other things, even in the health industry. Um, so I do think that we need to start taking the ball to their court, honestly, and holding them accountable however we can. And I think it's initiatives and conversations like these that are only going to encourage and further that strive.
Yes, absolutely. That is why we're here to have these discussions, to educate the public as much as we can, and to advocate for such issues. And it is really important for each one of us to take that stand, to put in the willpower, to put in the prioritization of mental health, which has been put aside for quite too long. Thank you so much, Mr. Sharon. Now, Ms. Radwan, I know that you work a lot with children. Now, when it comes to combating uh, stigmas through education, what can be done through the education of children and adolescents?
Sure. So I tackle this from 2 points of view. I feel like just as much as it's important to educate children on the idea of mental health, mental illness, or adolescence, it's also very important to educate the parents or the family the kids are surrounded by, because those people are the ones who are going to influence the kids' thoughts the most. And so if you grow up in a household where there's no open conversation about how you feel about your mental health, there's no encouragement to open up or something like that, the kids might then grow up with the idea that mental health isn't that important or isn't that effective in our life. So I do a lot of activities with the kids through worksheets, through CBT, during our sessions where I ask them to first tell me, for example, what their idea of mental health is, or if they're coming for a specific disorder or something, I ask them what they think it is. And we work through that, and I highlight to them the fact that they are in control of how they feel. Yes, mental illness is there, but there's a difference between having mental illness and being helpless and being not in control of anything. So I highlight that to them. And usually I spent the first session with psychoeducation, where we talk about, where I answer any of their questions. And I also spend like the last 10 minutes or something of the session talking to the parents and informing them of the proper ways to engage depending on the disorder with the child, and ensuring that they have the right idea of the onset of the disorders and so forth.
Thank you so much. That education, that dialogue is quite important. Thank you for giving us those examples. But I also want to ask, what kind of barriers do you reach, or what kind of barriers do you face when it comes to those processes?
Usually, the most barriers I face are with parents. Children usually are very perceptive. I've had faced barriers with parents who, due to the intense stigma of mental health and the like intense wrong idea of it, they refuse to believe that their child has any sort of disorder or any symptoms of disorder, and therefore they come to clinics with the idea or with the purpose of just tell me like my kid's okay and that this is a phase. And because of that, sometimes I've seen parents who, in certain tests for whether it's ADHD or intelligence tests, don't give out real answers in some cases. And I can see that through me having a session with the kid and seeing how the kid reacts, and then the parents answering after I've seen the kid. And so when that happens, although they have the intention of the kid, of positive intentions for the kid, of like in their eyes they're protecting them from future stigmas or whatever, such a thing can actually be a very big hindrance for the kids, because if you don't know that something is wrong, there's no way to fix it, there's no way to deal with it, and then that child will just sit with the feeling that they feel not normal, and they'll struggle through that, not understanding why.
Thank you so much for bringing up those challenges. I absolutely feel for you, and I hope that we can overcome them. Thank you so much, Ms. Radwan. Before we continue, I'd again like to remind everyone that you can pose questions and they will be answered live at the end of the webinar. Now, Dr. Ohanidu, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, my internet was shaky. Sorry, I didn't catch the last statement you made.
I was just about to ask you a question, Dr. Ohanidu. Now,
yes, I'm here. I went off video because of the internet. I wasn't too sure.
Yes. No worries, Dr. Ohanidu. We experience difficulties all the time during this pandemic. Dr. Ohanidu, what kind of changes would you want doctors and healthcare professionals to make within the next few years when it comes to stigmas in mental health and doing one-to-one interactions with their patients?
Okay, that's very important. That's very important because one, if you look at the numbers of professionals in the area like Akshay, we tell you the number of professionals in his field are few. They are not as many as possible, and you can't. The level of mental health globally is not something you do with only psychologists and psychiatrists. So you have to do it with every health worker. We are talking about integration of mental health into traditional healthcare so that it's not seen as a standalone. Because as a standalone, like I mentioned earlier, we come with its own stigma. You remember during the period of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, facilities that created standalone clinics for HIV patients further worsened the stigma for HIV patients until it was now mainstream into normal clinical management, for HIV patients. So it made it better. People were able to feel more less pressurized by the disease. So mental health is a bit like that. We need to be able to make sure mental health is in the right space. And then the providers, like you mentioned, they need to have the skill set. Every provider should be able to some extent, have some training around mental health. We need to scale up mental health to that level where they have basic skills around mental health, at least identification and interpersonal communication. Right communication is very, very important because if somebody has mental health and decides to go to the health facility, you can just say 2 words as a provider and you put up that person and the person goes back into the shell and probably never comes back to that facility. So you have to get it right. And so experts need to train, like experts in that field need to train providers. They need to build their skills, onboard them on skills around one, interpersonal communication and basic identification skills to see signs of mental health where there is one. Because a lot of even diseases that people present within facilities are psychosomatic, or if they are not psychosomatic, they have psychosomatic elements in the sense that there's a mind issue around it. So beyond the physical causal or the pathological side, there's also a mental pathology around it, which is something that they need to be able to see. And so it's very critical that in managing this person, your client, you need to manage the person in a holistic sense. So provider understanding of mental health is a very, very important way to go in the 21st century, because every provider should have a basic skill around understanding and identifying mental health, and also the right communication skills to onboard people into a treatment or referral for mental health. So this is very, very critical.
Thank you so much. There is a lot of responsibility there that I hope um, is met. That is a lot of work to do, and I really hope that everyone can move towards it. Thank you so much for giving us that very professional perspective, Dr. Ohanidu. Now, Mr. Sharon, when it comes to personal involvement, what kind and as you mentioned before, rapport, what kind of things can be done to build that rapport and those connections between people, between individuals and between professionals?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Um, So again, I'd like to emphasize, I mean, something similar that I said earlier, but I'm repeating it again only because of how crucial I think it is. Um, it's the understanding that we belong to the same group, especially when you're doing it within a geographical setting, of course, and if it's not a cross-cultural sort of perspective. I think it's really important to start discussing, common themes, common interests, common cultural practices. I think that's something that I found to be very useful in developing rapport in general, not just during my research, but I mean in my day-to-day interactions with fellow citizens of India, for example. Just to give you examples, in cab rides, a common topic is political, of course. It's to do with what the current scenario is, whether it's within the country or somewhere else, what the repercussions are, let's say on fuel prices, etc. And I think what I've observed is that after even minimal 5 minutes, there's an automatic change in the way that the interactions with that individual goes. So I do think it's important to always start at a positive note, on a positive note. There should be no conflict oriented starting point. I think it's always important to, even if there is differences in thought and in perceptions are only natural. I mean, you might find someone who's a political opponent, I mean, and believes in everything that you do not believe in. But I think it's our responsibility as people who understand what's going on around us, to actually start from a positive note of tolerance. And it should never be, the first step should never be conflict, in my opinion. And I think that automatically, I think that's just the beauty of rapport formation and how inter-individual interactions work. But it just seems to naturally flow after a certain point. Um, Other than that, I do have one general recommendation when we talk about stigma related to mental health and what can be done to address some of the challenges, including rapport formation. What's important to understand is, while I keep harping about a researcher's perspective, what is important is how someone who is not involved in the field, for example, let's say a person who does not have a mental illness and is not involved in the field, how they interact with people who do have mental illnesses. That is something that is way more important than a researcher's standpoint, in my opinion. And a proven way of doing something like this is called social contact theory in psychology. And the idea of social contact in general um, is that people who come from different walks of life, who have thoughts and beliefs that are on, let's say, different ends of the spectrum, they come together. And it's been found in repeated experiments, in experiments that have been replicated as well, um, that it actually works. There's a significant reduction in sort of the conflict that exists between these two groups that we're talking about. As I mentioned earlier, when you talk about social identity, there is a concept of an in group and an out group. The in group often perceives the out group and characterizes them using certain negative characteristics, terms, descriptive, whatever. Uh, I'm sure you understand what I mean. And vice versa. The out group also believes that these people who for those members are actually the out group, um, there are automatic negative perceptions towards them as well. And what this is doing, it's creating this natural barrier that we do not have a mental illness, we have a mental illness, and these are two distinct groups. The only way to get over that is social contact. Social contact has been proven to work in cases of religious extremism, in the sense that when there's conflict between two different religious groups, as there is in a lot of socio-cultural settings across the world, social contact theory has been seen to be a proven way of reducing that conflict and enhancing cooperation. Um, so I'm just like, honestly, as a young researcher, uh, I do sometimes have a hard time understanding why all this research and this bucket loads of research that is scientifically proven, peer reviewed, it exists, uh, but no one seems to be doing anything about it. I mean, it stops at a journal article or it stops at a research paper. Uh, but as soon as you even try implementing that into real life settings, it does actually work. And I think we need to start getting a little more creative in terms of our approach to tackling these issues on ground. Obviously, the traditional methods no longer work, like the awareness campaigns. While they might work at a micro level, they can't work at a macro level. And if governments do continue to fail in terms of addressing this issue, then the only thing that we can do at our end is social contact, whether that includes sending school children twice a week to a mental health care facility to spend the day. I mean, if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes, and we should do it. So I think that's where the creativity needs to start flowing, and we need to move from sort of traditional methods that we've been employing so far.
Absolutely. Those personal connections and social contact theory. Thank you for so much for bringing that up. There is a lot of research on this, but not really as much willpower. And in Amnesty International, with us, we believe in people power. We every day we may feel powerless in any certain situation, and we may feel like we're up against the most powerful entities around us, but we have to remember that we have people power, which is very legitimate and very powerful, and that is done by developing the connections between us. Thank you so much, Mr. Sharon. You certainly motivated me to put more action to it. Thank you so much. Now, Ms. Radwan, I would like to ask you a question, but we have a question from the audience
Sure.
for you. So Marilla asks, Ms. Radwan, you said that people pretty much only receive help when they are suicidal. How do people deal with family or friends actually committing suicide? Do they talk about it and try to fix it, or is that also considered a taboo?
So obviously there's no one set way people deal with such a tragedy. I feel like people often um, focus on the victim, which obviously is something very, very important, if not the most important thing. But a lot of people don't realize that certain family members or close friends can have feelings such as anger or resentment, or which is natural because they are put in a position that obviously no one was expecting, they don't understand, and that due to them wanting that person to still be alive. Also, I feel like, yeah, obviously people who are suicidal have more chances of receiving care because that's what's considered like high end or important mental health aspects rather than someone suffering from anxiety in general. But it's important to note that they're not the only ones.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rodwan, for answering that question from our audience. Um, I would like to ask you, when they try to deal with such extreme circumstances, what kind of steps do you see from your experiences that are taken, and if you've noticed any cultural differences in in those processes of dealing with such extreme circumstances?
Um, Personally, I had a roommate in college who was not suicidal, did not have any suicidal tendencies, but she was joking one day and told one of her friends that she wanted to die. And next thing we knew, there was the mental health and counseling services from the university knocking at our door, and they hospitalized her for 2 days or something to make sure that she didn't have any tendency, she wasn't of harm to herself or others. I don't think such a thing, I've never witnessed or experienced such a thing happen here. I mean, although that might be a good step in ensuring people are safe, there needs to be a threat level like study where people see where people are on the terms. Like if a person tells you, although such jokes are probably not that good, but if someone tells you like that's not serious, I feel like it'd be worse for her health. For example, for my friend to be in the hospital, to miss exams, to not be able to talk to people during that time, to be in an environment where she's not really aware, specifically since she was also an international student. Here, the focus is more rather on like health and science, the focus is more on religion. And if you confess to a problem or something, there's a chance you might go see a therapist, or there's a chance your family might want you to go see a religious figure or something to figure out the problem.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rodwan. It is quite important if any of us know anyone who's having such issues to be able to try to assist them in any way that we can. Now, now we're going to move to some more questions from the audience. This next one is for all of our speakers. It's from Kamala. How do we talk to loved ones that has self-stigma and the issue is not severe but suffers from high anxiety and fear of failure? Now, Ms. Redwan, you are the first one to mention self-stigma. So would you like to tackle the question that's in the chat
Sure.
function?
Sure. To put it very, very simply in a phrase, I would say be the person you or someone you care about wish you had. You might not be dealing with the same problem, so you might not know how to approach it. As long as one comes from a place of understanding, acceptance, no judgment, where you allow the person at their own pace to express themselves to you if they feel like it. Also, not to take things personally. Some things, for example, not wanting to talk or something could be a symptom of their disorder, or they might not be comfortable at the moment to share things. So going in with the mindset that you are doing this for the sake of the other person, with the person's best intentions in mind, whatever that may be. And think of if you were in a similar position, not necessarily the same, you didn't have the same mental disorder, but if you're in a position where you needed someone, what would you want a person to do for you?
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Radwan. Do Mr. Sharan or Dr. Ohanidu, would you guys like to answer the question as well?
Sorry, I was on mute. I was about to say that in as much as I like what Jude has said, and it's very important, I think for us, looking at it from a developmental side, in as much as why we acknowledge the role of societal and interpersonal processes involved in stigma creation, and social psychology studies have shown that it is important that we lead the person ultimately to understand that that they are not just an individual; they are part of a community, and community awareness is very critical. And so when we are trying to work with them out of this negative stereotype which they've internalized, we need to make them to understand that there's a group. They are part of a group that is positive and looks at this thing in a different way. It's very critical. So when we are also at the home level, we're looking at talking to people who we think have some level of self-stigma. We need to begin to to make them to understand, one, to be able to juxtapose what is normal in terms of experience that most people should have, and then understanding that those prejudices, those discriminations which have led to that level of mental illness in terms of sex, what's known as self-stigma, that is it's not a thing that anybody should ordinarily go through. So that brings it to this model that it will be ideal that even the person who is going through that process of talking to them has some basic understanding of the issues, because if you don't understand the issues, it will be difficult for you to really effectively relate with the person. So usually what happens that sometimes where they, like I mentioned earlier on, that where the household identifies that there's an issue, and it may not be that it's just self-stigma, but that there's an issue. It's always good that if there's a psychologist that is involved, he's able to begin to get like a family member that can begin at home to begin to work with this person outside the health facility, then be able to bring the person to see the issues at hand, and be able to respond to the larger treatment that can be offered at the clinical level. But at home, usually it is always good that somebody who has some understanding of this is in a good position to do that. But most of all, people who have good sense of empathy are usually a good candidate for this, because they're able to listen. They don't appear judgmental. They appear to empathize with the person on the emotional level. And people who are self-stigmatized are able to relate to emotional empathy. And so it's very important, because it also helps them come out of their diminished self-esteem at the way they look at themselves. They need to be able to see that somebody sees them on the same level and can be able to communicate with them. So that works better that way, so that their perceptions gradually can be worked on, and then they can begin to receive treatment or some form of counseling at facility level or at a clinical level, so that they can do better. For me, I think that is key. I wouldn't advise somebody who does not have some understanding of the issues to just go and dabble into just talking around it. It's always good to seek information and talk to people who are experts in it before you begin to jump into it, so that you don't worsen the scenario and make the person more withdrawn from any engagement at that level.
Yes, absolutely. Education has a very large part to it. Thank you so much, Dr. Ohanidu. Now, due to time constraints, I'm going to try to sort of combine two questions for Mr. Sharon from Riyadh and Kamala. Riyadh says, I have a question for Mr. Akshay. How do we help the poorer classes mentally when mental health support is expensive? Therapists are known for usually asking for high fees and known for scamming clients for money. How do we tackle these ideas? And shouldn't mental health be free or cheap? And if so, would it be possible? And Camilla also asks how to motivate them to seek mental health professional due to self-stigma, and it's difficult to convince. Uh, um, all right, Mr. Sharon, would you like to tackle those questions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Riyadh and Kamla, for your questions. I think it's a very relevant question that Riyadh has asked. It's often a dilemma that we all face, even when we're trying to encourage people who we know to seek therapy or to seek assistance. Um, so I do have a couple of points, which are all potential responses in some sense and potential solutions as well. One of the factors is what it seems like it's been an important point that we've been reiterating again and again, which Dr. Francis also mentioned a couple of times, which is that once you start integrating it with primary healthcare, automatically it's going to be more of a structured situation in terms of the amount of money that's given to the institution, whether it's in a hospital or not. All of this automatically actually reduces costs. So, for example, just to give you anecdotal evidence, in India, the counselor that I used to go to when I was seeking therapy, in a hospital setting, would charge half of what would be charged at a private session. So it seems like an existing institution, like a hospital, a well-reputed hospital, uh, has, in some sense, made mental health care more affordable for a lot of people. The idea of scamming and asking for high fees is very prevalent, of course, but it is more prevalent in private practice as compared with institutional practice. Let's say at the clinic level or at the hospital level. I would be interested in hearing what's happening in other countries and how that works. But that at least is the case in India. Um, I do also have another idea, but this may be a bit of a long shot and maybe a little controversial as well. Um, I do think that this sort of curve that we've seen in terms of barriers to mental health, it's always been at a very high level given the fees. I think that this is something that is actually going to self-correct. As we move, the most important variable in all of this is time. Um, it appears, and this is again without any statistically significant evidence, but it appears that the the people who today are getting into clinical practice, into therapy, into counseling, are genuinely getting into it because of a passion for that particular subject or for that area. This is a bit of a different situation from what happened before, where this was an up and coming industry where there were not a lot of rules and regulations, not a lot of psychological contracts, as you would say. Um, and so I do think that it was exploited in some sense as an industry. But I do think it's going to self correct because it is people like us who are going to be the next clinical psychologists in our respective countries. Um, I mean, people who studied psychology with me, for example, 80% of them want to be a clinical psychologist. And that's usually because they've either experienced something which has brought them to this, and it makes them feel like they want to help others go through similar experiences that they've had. Uh, and so, actually, at a statistical level and at a conceptual level, it actually may self correct over a period of time. Just to give you an example, um, I used to work for this business psychology organization around a year ago, and we started this mental health initiative. The unique thing about this initiative was that the first session was free. Um, Now, this is sort of like an unsaid rule in practice, but counselors and therapists often do give one session for free. What we realized was, and I hope this addresses Ms. Kamla's question as well. Um, what this what this actually does is that because of the sort of financial situation that individuals are in, especially people in rural India or from the urban poor section in the community, it's the financial scare which is actually the biggest limit and the biggest barrier. Um, it's been it happens all the time that people hide from their parents to speak to therapists and to speak to counselors. But another big factor, other than just the parental influence and what others are going to say, is definitely the financial aspect of things. And that's why before an investment is made into something like mental health care, I think as psychologists, it's absolutely our duty to convince the general public that what we're offering is actually worth it. And that's why that one free session actually made a lot of a difference. Because maybe some people came purely for one session because they were going through a traumatic event, which could have been solved, of course, not in one session, but they could have been assisted to a certain extent in one session, and after that, they could stop. Similarly, we kept an option open where if the counselor was to agree with the socioeconomic status of the client, then they could continue at whatever rate they would decide, and we would be happy to sort of create that linkage for free. Um, and I think this is something that can work, especially if we sort of blow it up in terms of proportion and we seek to do this at a higher level. I do think that it is an intervention of sort that can work. Uh, Other than that, I mean, the most I wouldn't say generic, but it's cliched in some sense because of the number of times we repeat this. Uh, but I mean, there are health drives that happen for three months across villages and across states. Similarly, part of a health drive could absolutely be mental health care. Uh, and let's say if that drive was to go on for 3 months or for 1 month or whatever duration, um, I think that could really benefit in genuinely improving the quality of community interaction that exists at the rural level. So that's another reason that I would give for how we can actually improve the situation. I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to rephrase or ask me a follow up.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sharon. Now, due to time constraints, we will move to some closing remarks that any of our speakers would like to make. Riyadh says that yes, it helped. Thank you. I am studying my last year in Bachelor's of Psychology, and your information is very relieving and helpful to hear. Thank you for your time and contribution to all our learning and awareness of this important topic. And Kamala also says that yes, it was helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, we'll now move to some closing remarks. Who would like to begin? Ms. Radwan, would you like to begin with some closing remarks? Your mic is muted.
Okay, does this work?
Yes.
Okay. So I feel like some of the talks we're doing, such as the one we're doing right now, is a very important step in not only opening the topic of stigma and mental health, but ensuring that it is always on our agenda and something that we always want to work and strive towards. Also, in terms of the idea of payment that was mentioned, here, for example, we have in the clinic I volunteer at, depending on your economic status or reason, we offer free therapy for specific people who need it. Although it is true that payment is definitely a very big barrier when it comes to treatment. It is very important to keep an open, honest conversation and assure people that they can say whatever they want to say about mental health. And yeah, pretty much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Radwan. Dr. Oanyudu, would you like to make any final remarks?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your time, everybody. I think very important is that we should have a sort of, moving forward, we need to have some form of conceptual framework around how we do mental health stigma reduction. And this, we look at the issues around mental health from cross-cutting as well as non-cross-cutting level. Non-cross-cutting level, we can say government, what is it that you have to do? Okay, government, these are the interventions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are key. And critical among these, like I said, is integration. And you cannot gainsay that. Integration is key. How do we make sure mental health is normal as part of service delivery? Very important. Then we can talk about other indirect health sector mental health interventions, okay? Looking at how do you make sure young people are able to be screened for mental health when they get to health facility, for example. Very important, alongside other things like STIs and other diseases, integrated in a package, Then look at other sectoral strategies, like private sector. Are there any programs for mental health within private organizations, whether companies or whatever, do they do anything? Are there other strategies that indirectly affect the way even mental health outcomes occur within our setting? We need to work around all those things. And that framework is very critical because, and it has to be financed, to be able to get us the service delivery for mental health that we want. But most important is putting mental health at the cornerstone of health system, which is primary health care. Once you're able to unbundle mental health to that level, you will reduce costs like Ashram pointed out, you will reduce a problem of coverage. There will be higher coverage and also accessibility, because at that level, people will be able to reach it no matter their financial level, whether they are bottom of the social pyramid or not. They should be able to do that. So these are some of the critical things that we need to do to make sure that we're able to get mental health service delivery at the level we want it in our countries.
Absolutely, that is a lot that we need to do, and we should really get going on it. That is amazing advice, all the way from the governmental to the individual level. Thank you so much, Dr. Ohanidu, for being here, and thank you so much for answering the questions and for giving us your time. Mr. Sharon, would you like to make any final remarks?
Yes, absolutely, Zach. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting us here and for this session. I think it's been incredibly insightful from multiple perspectives, both cultural and, uh, of course, a variety of differences between us. But it seems like we've come together on a platform and come up with a conversation that is really worth thinking about and reflecting on. I would just like to highlight 2 points. And this is my summation of how I think we need to address stigma related to mental health and also improving the quality of mental health services. The first would be putting the onus onto governments, as I mentioned earlier. World leaders are elected for a particular reason, but they're not held accountable for some of those reasons that they're elected for. Um, and that is an incredible fault on our part as citizens of our respective countries. And I think that needs to change. Um, why do we keep talking about world leaders? It's not like we're trying to take the onus off of ourselves or off of individuals or off of communities. It's because over time we have learned, as per the psychology of leadership, that leaders have a particular social influence that ordinary citizens might not have in their daily lives. And I think that it's absolutely critical that we make use of the social influence that exists. And this ties in very well a psychological concept of social influence with a more practical concept, as Dr. Francis mentioned, of coverage. Um, and that's exactly how it should be used. I mean, it appears theoretically to be a perfect amalgamation of two different perspectives. And it's something that can absolutely work. And that's why pressure on world leaders is my primary recommendation. From the other side, from academia and in terms of the general public, I think we need to improve the communication that exists between research that happens and research that is communicated to the public. Um, and for those of you who are interested, the technical term for this is called science communication. And that's why I think we need a more modern model of how science communication can be improved, so that thousands and millions of dollars that are spent on research, I mean, if that is not informed to the public, then what was the point of the research? Research is done for public betterment. It's for the betterment of society. And I do think that there's an inherent need to improve scientific communication.
Communication and education, that is absolutely important. Thank you so much for bringing that up and for being here with us. Thank you so much. I know it is quite late where you are right now, so thank you so much for joining us in a inconvenient hour. Um, now, with all the final remarks complete, we will be ending our session this evening. Once again, I'd like to thank our speakers for being here, and thank all of our participants for participating and for being here, for asking questions. Thank you so much. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Tanvi for helping facilitate this. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you so much. Now, I'd like to just make a few comments before we end. First of all, if you have any further questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to email us at Amnesty International at mdxsu.com. You received the link from that very email. I can write it in the chat function right now. Please feel free to email us if you have any questions or concerns, or if you have any certain topics or project ideas that you would like us to work on. If you would like to recommend anything, please let us know. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for coming here. We do have 2 more sessions on the 18th of March, which will be on the legislation and government responsibility towards the advancement of mental health. And then the one on the March 26th will be on individual involvement of activists and advocates for mental health. If you haven't already signed up for those events, you still can via the Eventbrite link that you signed up for to this event. And I look forward to seeing you all again. And hopefully I will be able to meet and work with our speakers soon. Thank you so much to all of you for being here this evening, and have a great night.
Thank you, all of you, for being here.